good to be with you all today. Hopefully we'll have an interesting, enlightening conversation. Max and I have had a couple of those already just before we join you on stage. Before we get too far into that, let's talk a bit about Max Holmes and the Woodwell Climate Research Group, which is not the Woods Hole Research Group. Help us with the distinction there.
Yeah, okay, so you and everyone else in the world is confused about Woods Hole and what that is. Woods Hole is a village in the town of Falmouth in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. It has several different independent research organizations housed there. The Marine Biological Laboratory, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the Sea Education Association. There's also a USGS lab, a NOAA National Marine Fisheries Lab. And in 1985, the Woods Hole Research Center was founded. 4 years ago, the Woods Hole Research Center, we changed our name to the Woodwell Climate Research Center to honor our founder, George Woodwell, who on June 18th passed away at 95 years old, an absolutely amazing visionary scientist, one of the founders of EDF and lots of other environmental organizations. But we're the ones that are focused on, and this was George's vision those 38, 39 years ago, focused on doing fundamental science related to the climate system, particularly the role of biological systems, forests and soils and so on, to do the science and then to connect that science to impact, to make a difference, to put the brakes on climate change. So we're involved in the original drafting of the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We participate in all of the COPs, Conference of the Parties, the big international climate negotiations. Two of my predecessors as president of the organization got plucked away from us by the President of the United States. In the first case—
That's quite an honor.
Yeah, so John Holdren, who was Obama's science advisor for all 8 years of the Obama administration. And then more recently, 3 years ago, I guess, the president at the time, the Woodwell president at the time, Phil Duffy, again got a call from the White House, and he's a climate advisor in the White House. So I bring those examples up just to illustrate how we do the science, the fundamental science. We have scientists around the world, but then we work really hard to connect that science to impact.
Then it's not just about polar bears, it's actually about the impacts here, where people live, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. We work in, the key regions of the world, and, everywhere, I guess, but yeah, it's not enough for us, for our scientists to write really good scientific papers that other scientists read. They do that, but it's in the sort of DNA of the organization to connect that to impact, to hopefully put the brakes on climate change.
Well, glad to be here with you, Max. One of the things we're going to be talking about, or the theme of what we're talking about, is nature-based climate solutions. And before we get into that, because I feel like often in these conversations, the tendency is just to be technical really quickly, of let's just talk about what is the solution and how does it work. But I wonder if you could paint a picture for us a little bit in a more idealistic sense to talk about what is the world that we want to live in, to envision that kind of future.
Yeah, so I like that question. It's a big question. I'll approach it from maybe a different direction. One question I've gotten, so climate change is a tough topic, right? And we haven't had nearly as many victories or as much progress as we'd like. We've known sort of the fundamental problems, and we've known actually what the solutions were for a long time, but we haven't really been enacting them at scale. And so a question I've probably first got, 25 years ago, and I repeatedly get is something along the lines of, how do you keep doing this day after day, week after week, year after year, when you're not really making that much progress? And I've struggled with answering that question in the past, and there are scientists and psychologists studying mental health of climate scientists, because really, and I get it. And it used to be my answer there was, this was the best I could do. There's sort of a worst case scenario when we think about where we're headed in terms of climate, and I don't even want to think of that world out there in that worst case scenario. And there's a best case scenario, and that's not so great either, but it's better than the worst case scenario, and at least I could imagine my kids and maybe grandkids and stuff like that living out there. And when I would say that, I recognized this wasn't an inspiring vision, but it was being at least honest to my scientific understanding and my ability to imagine a positive future. But over the years, and really in the last just several years, my answer to that question has changed, because my hope, as the word that Fred used, my hope is increased for a number of reasons. There are lots of different solutions that are starting to come to scale, and I'm increasingly hopeful and maybe even marginally, well, I am optimistic that we can, and can's, underline the can, it's not will, but can, we can end up in a good place, this positive future. And when I think of that, what does that mean? I mean that people around the world have access to the energy they need to lead a reasonable quality of life. And there's lots of people in the world that right now don't have that energy that they get is produced by sources that aren't putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that are making climate change worse. And that's starting, those renewable and other sources are starting to scale, so I'm optimistic about that. It's a world where we still have the Amazon and the Congo and the biodiversity in the ocean and the indigenous people that rely on these forests and soils and ecosystems and so on. And it's also probably a world that doesn't have 8.1 or 10 billion people on it. And so that positive future is farther out. And I'm encouraged by some of the demographic data that are coming out, which is when people are educated and have a reasonable quality of life, they're having fewer children. And so this future is out there, but it's a lot easier to imagine this positive future with less than 10 billion people on it.
Sure, yeah, and thank you for indulging the question, because I was sharing with Max that I was in Glacier National Park right before this, and even right outside the park on a ridgeline, I saw this huge wind farm, and there's a part of me that got excited because it's like, that's beautiful, because that's the kind of stuff we need to see to preserve the beauty of so many other places, right? So to talk about some specific climate solutions, on stage just a bit ago, you heard from the Environmental Defense Fund talking about this idea of being a tree hugger, and that was something we were talking about, is that trees, and we have some beautiful aspens on stage with us, trees are maybe the best climate solution out there.
Photosynthesis is probably the best climate solution out there. And it's just miraculous to think about the seed of a sequoia or a ponderosa, any tree. It's this tiny little thing that turns into this massive being. And where did all that material come from? First of all, half of that material is carbon. And all that material, all that carbon came from CO2 in the atmosphere. So let trees, let forests do their thing. They're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. They're storing it in their being, in their bodies. They're supporting all other kinds of co-benefits, biodiversity, water quality, all on and on and on. But yeah, it's in order, preserving the forests that we have, restoring the forests that we can is absolutely essential for getting to this positive future. And maybe we should talk a little bit about, what is driving the climate change? Or, well, first of all, just the climate change that we're seeing. And the number one source of greenhouse gases, heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, is use of fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and natural gas. And there's no solution to climate change without getting off of fossil fuels or capturing emissions associated with the use of fossil fuels.
Right, because if we keep burning coal, oil, and gas, it doesn't matter how many trees we plant or save, correct?
We're not going to plant enough trees to solve that problem. So we got to get off that. And just a couple of words on that line before I start to talk about the natural climate solutions, or the greenhouse gas sources from using, from land use change. But anyone on the face of the earth right now, from the youngest to the oldest person, over the course of their life has only seen annual greenhouse gases increase year after year, year after year. There have been a couple of downswings with recessions or a pandemic, but those don't last long, and that trajectory to increasing greenhouse gas emissions just increases. One thing I find incredibly exciting right now is that arguably we're at the peak. If we're not at the peak, we're probably pretty close to it, and then we'll start coming down the other side. And that's a moment of celebration. Now, the reality, that doesn't mean celebrate, forget it, job done. Right. But that is an amazing transition. It's then absolutely essential to come down quickly and not come down slowly. But that is an amazing transition, and that's the rapid scaling up of non-greenhouse gas emitting energy sources. Okay, the number two source of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere is land use change, mainly deforestation, and where deforestation is still happening in a big way, as we heard in the earlier talk, is in the tropics, in the Amazon, in the Congo, in Indonesia. And we have to figure out ways to put the brakes on deforestation if we're going to put the brakes on climate change. I was in the Amazon less than a month ago in Brazil, and right at the agricultural frontier, a place that 3 decades ago would have been rainforest as far as the eye could see, and now it's massive agricultural area. And the reality is that deforestation associated with agricultural expansion is still increasing. It's incredibly frustrating, it's incredibly challenging. I've long sort of wondered, why can't people just appreciate the intrinsic value of forests, of biodiversity, of nature, and stop doing this? But I've sort of begrudgingly come to the realization that if there's more money to be made, and this is kind of the point that Fred Krupp made, but if there's more money to be made by cutting down trees than leaving them standing, that's an incredibly powerful force, so we have to figure out how to counteract that force. And that's where I very much agree with Fred that there's the potential for carbon markets to mobilize that kind of money that's going to be needed to get the job done. There's not enough money in philanthropy. There's important seed money to do that. Governments aren't forthcoming with the money, but there is this potential with companies around the world making these net zero pledges and trying to succeed in those pledges by both, number one, reducing their own emissions, but then also purchasing credits from others who are reducing emissions, and putting the brakes on deforestation has the potential to help with that.
Max, let me ask you, how do you think we do that right? Because this is a big, complicated issue with carbon markets, right? There's some devoted to reforestation, some devoted to preserving forests. How do you think, if we were just going to do one thing, how do we do that right?
Again, I'm going to harken back to Fred Krupp's talk, because if you think about that methane sat, a super cool thing, that's not solving any problem. I mean, it's not plugging the methane leaks, right? It's science, it's scientific observations that's highlighting where methane is leaking from oil and gas operations. And then that scientific information, those observations, allow others to plug the holes to fix the problem. So with tropical deforestation and hoping to make carbon markets work to put the brakes on deforestation, our scientists at Woodwell, along with collaborators really around the world, are working to use scientific observations, some from satellites that are circling the Earth, some from folks on the ground making measurements, to, on a global scale, create what we're calling a landscape capital index that will shed light on the quality of carbon credits that could be generated in any landscape on Earth. It would give information about, are these carbon credits, are the forests, for example, threatened by fire or disease or lack of government and so on. I mean, one of the reasons that carbon markets haven't lived up to their potential, and if you followed the story of carbon markets, there's the press, rightfully so, has been all over them and pointing out the problems with the carbon markets, because people don't know, they don't have a way to evaluate the credit the quality of a carbon credit that could be generated from a particular landscape. So we think our science can help with that. We're hopeful that our science and other science will help with that, so that there'll be credibility and transparency in the carbon markets, and thus it can scale to protect the things we care about, which are forests and people and nature and biodiversity and so on.
So one of the keys, you think, is really figuring out what is the price of a forest, of preserving a forest, and maybe related to that, of like, what is the price of dumping emissions into the sky, right? Like we've been treating it like a landfill up there.
Yeah, that's right, and where our science can really help with that. Again, we're not going to put the price on a carbon credit. The market will do that, but we can shed light on the quality of a carbon credit that could be generated from any landscape, and thus the markets can have a price that's based on reality, as opposed to people just not really knowing what a reasonable price is. Markets can work. Markets don't work if there's not that sort of transparency.
Sure. And as predicted, our time is flying by, but hopefully we can get to a couple of things before we have to wrap up. One of the, I think, interesting things about this idea of agriculture is that, like, the deforestation of the Amazon, as you can certainly speak to, a lot of that is being driven by food production. And, when I talk about climate change on television, it's, well, this is a collective problem. This is a system problem. But there are some things that we as individuals could do, and even though we both hate to admit it, part of that is what we eat, our diet.
Yeah, so, one of the things that struck me when I was in the Amazon, first, just looking at these vast areas of deforestation, and then you're looking at what is grown in those areas, and it's soy, it's corn, there's some cotton now, but it's not anything that is going into a human's mouth. It's, for the most part, things that is going into an animal's mouth that then we later eat. And, agriculture is by far the biggest land use globally, and the vast majority of agricultural lands are used either for grazing directly or for producing food that animals eat. And I'll just talk about personally, I'm not a vegetarian, but it's increasingly difficult for me, to eat high on the food chain. And so and not to speak about this issue, and I've avoided kind of talking about diet because nobody really wants to be told, don't eat that thing.
Well, we agreed, like, I enjoy a cheeseburger, but I feel guilt when I'm eating beef.
Yeah, and when I was leaving the Amazon just a few weeks ago, I saw this, well, I'll say field now, but it was a forest, and it probably just weeks before, and it was burning. But what they do is they have two huge bulldozers with a massive chain between them and just start plowing through the forest, knocking down every tree. And we were in a very similar forest a couple days before, looking at monkeys and all kinds of amazing biodiversity. And then, they just chain the fields, plow the trees down, let them dry a little bit, burn them, and plant soy or something else to feed animals that we later eat. So yeah, it's an important thing, and this is not saying everyone's got to go out and be a vegan tomorrow, but certainly what I'm trying to do personally is eat lower on the food chain, and that's one action that we all can take that actually makes a difference to what the future of the Amazon, amazingly enough.
Sure, because even taking climate change out of it, there is that amazing, the photosynthesis, the dance of the trees are breathing out what we breathe in, and then what we breathe out, they breathe in, right? So we do need to talk about that as a climate solution. Before we run out of time, I just want to quickly touch on something which maybe if you don't know much about this can be a homework project to go and search more about. Enhanced rock weathering. I'm just starting to do research on a story on this. For folks that don't know, why is this an interesting area?
Yeah, and I'm speaking not as an expert on this topic, but somebody who's super interested in. We're trying to think about what we can do so we think a lot about regenerative agriculture. Are the things that we can do to store more carbon in soils, to boost crop productivity, these win-win kinds of things. Enhanced rock weathering is basically a process by which you're grinding up silicate minerals, rocks, basalt, for example, spreading that on fields, farmers spreading that on fields. That can, in the best case, that boosts agricultural productivity, but then the weathering, the breaking down of those minerals pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stores it for a really long time. So you get the climate benefit, you get the crop yield benefit, and it's possible to imagine this scaling broadly. So we're starting to get involved in some experiments on enhanced rock weathering. There are companies already out there that are doing this and selling carbon credits. I'd say the science right now is, well, it's rapidly progressing. There's a lot more to be done there. But yeah, this is one of those potential solutions that can really scale to a large degree, potentially store a lot of carbon for a long time, but also get those benefits in crop productivity and so on, reducing the pressure to deforest more lands.
Nature's really cool, isn't it?
Nature is cool.
Gives us all the tools we need. I know we're out of time, but Max, wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.